to this unique conclave on national security perspectives. The Way Forward, organized by the Madras Management Association along with Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. Shri M.K. Narayan, former National Security Advisor of India and former Governor of West Bengal, our distinguished chief guest this evening. The other distinguished guests of honor and panelists for the evening, General V.R. Raghavan, retired, BSM, UISM, AVSM, military strategic thinker, former Director General of Military Operations, Indian Army, Professor Varun Sahni, Vice Chancellor, Goa University, Dr. Sridhar Krishnaswamy, Professor of Journalism, SRM Institute of Science and Technology, and Foreign Policy Analyst, and the former Washington correspondent of The Hindu, Shri K. Srinivasan, Managing Director, Carborundum Universal Limited, Mr. Peter Rimmel, Resident Representative to India, Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, Shri Pankaj Madan, Deputy Head, India Office and Head Programs, Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, Shri N. Satyamurthy, Director, Observer Research Foundation, ORF Chennai, Director of JSDP Partner Organizations of Gas, who have come from all over India. Invitees from ORF, IITM, Alumni Associations, IIM, and IIMC, Alumni Associations, NIPM, IIMM, MCCI, serving defense officers, invitees, guests, and members of MMA. A very warm welcome to all of you. Considering the phenomenal contribution MMA makes in propagating management movement among the corporate members, students, and the public at large, MMA, the largest management association in the country, has been adjudged the best management association in the country for the last 10 years in a row. Today's conclave, thank you. Today's conclave is the fourth in the series on the theme National Security Perspectives, the Way Forward. The earlier conclaves under the series, Functional Governance, were Functional Governance for a New India, Issues and Opportunities, Tamil Nadu Experience, with a focus on the Dravidian years, and the third conclave on Politics of Economics, which deliberated upon the future of nation's political economy. Today's conclave focuses on the medium-term review of the multidimensional security concerns and issues of the nation, with the objective of providing a basis for the future discourse at various levels of governance and public opinion. We will also be witnessing deliberations on some of the key security issues facing the nation, and we have experts in national strategy and security who have come all the way to present their views. Given the profile of the speakers and their vast experience in governance, there can be little doubt that the conclave would be of immense benefit and value to all the participants today and viewers watching this conclave live from all over. A special word of thanks and our gratitude to Mr. Peter and to Shri Pankaj for choosing MMA to host this unique conclave, which is timely and relevant. Once again, I welcome the former presidents of MMA, my colleagues from the Managing Committee, members of MMA, distinguished invitees, and members of the media. Wishing you all a great evening.
Mr. Peter Rimmel is the Resident Representative to India, Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, Resident Representative for Lebanon Program, and Director of Rule of Law Program, Middle East, North Africa for the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. I now invite Mr. Peter Rimmel to deliver the introductory remarks.
Mrs. Kavita Chitara, immediately past President of the Madras Management Association, our partner. Mr. M.K. Narayanan, former National Security Advisor of India, Lieutenant General Raghavan, and all the other dignitaries on the dais. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our event. Good evening again. It's a pleasure to be again amongst you all for the fourth MMA, ORF, and CAS Conclave for National Security Perspectives, the Way Forward. in the series of national seminars on functional governance. I feel privileged to be part of this gathering, in which we will seek to reflect on multidimensional security concerns and issues of the Indian nation and nations worldwide, and thereby will try to provide a possible basis for a future discourse on various levels of governance and public opinion. Diverging and common national security perspectives are a field of strong interest for policymakers, the national opinion matters, and the civil society of respective countries alike. I'm not an expert on India's security in a very specific sense, and will leave this topic to the highly regarded experts present here on the dais. But I can definitely share and shed some light on where Germany stands with respect to its own and the global strategic and security scenario. On 11th and 12th July 2018, during the NATO summit, when Donald Trump tried to question the meaning of the alliance, something remarkable happened in Washington. The US Parliament, in rare bipartisan unanimity, opposed its own president, with the Senate passing a resolution in support of NATO. The resolution emphasized the determination of the United States to continue contributing to the common defense alliance. The resolution's outcome aimed to show the alliance with the Europeans is unquestionable for the US national security itself. Nonetheless, critics argue that some allies in Europe do not contribute their fair share to the cost of the common defense cause, and they mostly call out Germany in this report. It is not popular to speak openly about military issues in Germany. This has to do with Germany's past, and when in the last years almost a pacifist approach was followed up. Nevertheless, the majority of politicians would like to have it both ways: the guaranteed security and the liberation from the need to express the need of guaranteed security. This is different in India. The existence of NATO at the core of Germany's national interests, as well as it has been the close relationship with the United States, what has somehow defined our national post-war renaissance. And working collectively through NATO, the European Union, and other institutions is embedded in modern Germany's DNA. Therefore, unilateral approaches are rather disturbing and strange for us. There is no doubt that security concerns have multiplied in the post-Cold War era, which was based on a world constantly adjusting and readjusting to changing global situations. Today we are looking at an India which is faced with both external and internal security concerns, and some internal concerns emanating from across the borders. The nation's security concerns have also begun expanding from land space and land borders to the maritime, naval, and also aerial space, and maybe soon in outer space as well. What is more, the growing Indian economy has added further facets to the national security perspective, ranging from trade routes to energy security, and all related to the security of seas. So one could ask the question in our discussion later on, and that could be addressed, if India should do it all alone, or if it should look for like-minded allies. And with like-minded, I mean countries who, like India, believe in a world order what is based on rules. But what's the solution to the diverging national security perspectives in the country and worldwide? How can multilateralism be attractive again and prevail against unilateralist approaches? What role does maritime security play, and how can partnership in this area improve national security perspectives? If we look at the Indian Ocean, or now even the term Indo-Pacific is used to widen it, we see that most trade routes, most of the world trade is going through it. The energy supply of India is dependent on the freedom of the ocean, but also that one of China. So there are many related issues to regulate the law of the sea. Which role does cybersecurity play on the whole issue? Are there ways of reducing risks and dangers in an increasingly interconnected and globalized world? I only pose questions, and I hope to get some answers on those questions later on. We have an entire panel of experts on the topic today, and it would be rather enriching to hear from them. I'm sure everyone present here is eager, as I am myself. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my privilege to introduce our chief guest. Mr. M.K. Narayan is an Indian diplomat and former IPS officer. He was, before that, Mr. Satyamurthy has a few views to share.
Good evening, everybody. It is nothing great. As a moderator of the session, I want to set the ground rules. After the main speaker speaks and other eminent speakers share their views and critiques, and after Mr. Narayanan has responded to them and they have their discussions, there will be an open house, but open house, as the MMA ORF rule goes, is only through written questions. And there are no observations or comments, only simple straight questions. And when the question is taken up for being read out here, the writer of the question should be present and make sure that he is there. That's all. Over to you.
Mr. M.K. Narayan is an Indian diplomat and former IPS officer. He was the National Security Advisor of India from 2005 to 2010. Subsequently, he served as Governor of West Bengal from 2010 to 2014. The Government of India awarded him the civilian honor of Padma Shri in 1992. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our chief guest, Mr. M.K. Narayan, as I now invite him to address the August gatherings.
Thank you for the introduction. Ms. Kavita Chituri, immediate past president of the Madras Management Association and joint managing director of KCP Limited. Mr. Peter Rimmel, resident representative of Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. All that I have to say is that I had an opportunity to meet the old man. So that makes me, I think, a part of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. Today's panel of experts, Lieutenant General Raghavan, Dr. Sridhar Krishnaswamy, Mr. K. Srinivasan and Professor Varun Sani, Mr. N. Satyamurthy, Director of the Observer Research Foundation, Mr. Pankaj Madan, Deputy Head of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, Group Captain R. Vijay Kumar, Madras Management Association, and members of this very distinguished audience. It's a privilege to be asked to speak to such an august audience. The subject I've been asked to speak on is, as Mr. Peter Rimmel said a few minutes ago, one of great contemporary significance, namely national security perspectives, the way forward. I hope I shall be able to do justice to the subject in the limited time available. I look forward to your response at the conclusion of my address. Coming to the title of my talk today, it is inspired by the fact that not only does national security have many dimensions, but as the world of geopolitics and geoeconomics begin to intersect more frequently, the contours of national security are shifting. I think this is the point that Mr. Peter Rimmel also hinted at in his address. Politics and history are at present important determinants of economic policies and tactics. Political decisions are in turn being shaped by different considerations. In addition to economics and trade, personal chemistry, individual predictions, diplomatic considerations all play a part. It's a vast subject, and I thought to make it easier for you to comprehend what I'm trying to say, I shall divide my talk into 4 segments. First, the state of the world. Next, the new strategic imperatives. Third, the security matrix. Fourth, the internal security dimensions, apart from a very brief conclusion. Let us look at the state of the world we live in today. Global disorder is a dominant feature at present. Many liberal nations, especially in Europe, are facing widespread protests over questions of equity, including citizenship, identity, and the position of religious, linguistic, and ethnic minorities, with France, Belgium, and Netherlands probably the worst affected in this respect. The same applies to many other countries across the world, not excluding India. On the other hand, authoritarian states such as Russia, China, Turkey, etc., are seemingly insulated from such unrest, but even there are undercurrents of tension. Nationalism is a new mantra across the world. Countries like China, Russia, Turkey, and more recently even the United States are using nationalism to great effect, even if it means undermining the basic rules of international conduct. An excess of nationalism does, however, carry with it the risk of new conflicts. The growing tensions in the Azov Sea following Russia's seizure of Ukraine ships, for instance, runs the risk of becoming a major conflagration, pitting Russia on one side and NATO and European nations on the other. The situation that is emerging in Venezuela today, with one group of countries led by the US seeking the ouster of President Maduro, and another group led by Russia backing him, carries the seeds of a graver conflict. Intemperate statements from leaders like US Vice President Mike Pence and equally strong reactions from China and other nations are meanwhile pushing the world into a new Cold War. Whether this would be of the kind witnessed in the latter half of the 20th century is not certain as of now, but the fact is that tensions between countries are far higher today than at any time in the past half a century. Newer challenges have also emerged. The US-China trade war is leading to highly unsettled conditions across the globe. Politics is conflicting with business. The global campaign against Chinese telecommunication giant Huawei, which is being driven by the United States, is aimed at thwarting Huawei from building the next generation of 5G computers. This is intended at one level to prevent a new arms race taking place, one that involves technology rather than conventional weapons. At another level, it is an attempt to deny China, apart from commerce and economics, a significant military intelligence advantage, which it could then sustain for much of the 21st century. Consequently, an intimidating political climate is tending to upset normal economic calculations. Among other dangers, or danger signals, with important political ramifications are signs of fragility and a slowing down of the Chinese economy, the possibility of a sharp decline in British financial assets and the pound sterling following Brexit, and of the US moving into a period of slower long-term growth which could persist for a fairly long time. The spiraling trade war between the US and China and its related aspects can adversely affect India. It could lead to complications regarding trade adjustments. It could impact India's ability to achieve stable economic growth. If matters were to spin out of control, it could create rifts in areas such as security and diplomacy, involving some of India's present allies. Ladies and gentlemen, together with signs of a renewed nuclear arms race, unresolved climate change issues, and state-sponsored disinformation campaign. I'm sorry that I'm posting a bleak outlook for the world. Coming to the new strategic imperatives, what is most evident is that the world today confronts a leadership vacuum. This is a function of the declining influence of the United States in world affairs, which has no doubt been in evidence for some time, but has been further aggravated by President Trump's America First policy. The result has been a further reduction of the US global footprint, especially in Asia. Of late, a new factor has been Russia's re-emergence on the global scene. This is beginning to disturb the global equilibrium of the post-Cold War era. Russia's relations with the US, Europe, and the West today are perhaps at their lowest point ever. The West has accused Russia of every kind of crime against it, including running a global campaign of cyber attacks. Russia, however, remains undeterred and is seeking to become a key player in Eurasia and become more involved in the politics of Asia, especially West Asia. Russia, in turn, has forged a strategic relationship with China. This has more than ordinary relevance for countries of Asia, especially India. Russia and China recently held massive joint military exercises, giving rise to the specter of the two countries pooling their military strengths for future eventualities. This is no doubt causing the US and the West a great deal of concern, but it is also a matter of considerable concern to India. At the very least, it could adversely impact the warm friendship that exists between India and Russia. India is today being forced to try and strike a proper balance in its relations with the United States and Russia. On the one hand, it has gone closer to the United States, but its traditional ally, Russia, has moved closer to China. Despite this aspect, India's main security concern or dilemma will be how to manage relations with a resurgent China, especially in Asia. China is constantly seeking and to some extent succeeding in outmaneuvering India in the Asian region. For example, it has recently forged warm relations with Japan and Vietnam, two countries with whom India has had long established relations. In South Asia, China's efforts are directed at weakening India's relations with countries in the latter's neighborhood. This, in turn, is triggering security concerns. Whatever one might say, the truth is that there is an expanding asymmetry of power between China and India today. India-China relations may be marked by a surface calm, but underneath there is an unstated struggle for influence in Asia. The most potent weapon in China's political, economic, and military armory at present is its Belt Road Initiative, or BRI. The BRI hopes to reshape the geography across Asia and Eurasia, with plans for roads and railways across the region, as also ports dotting the Indian Ocean region. Almost every country in Asia, with the exception of India, and including more recently Japan and Vietnam, are a part of the BRI. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is the linchpin of the Belt Road Initiative. But there are other supplemental corridors in the offing, such as the Burma-China Economic Corridor. India has thus every reason to feel encircled by China's efforts. China also seeks to undermine India's position in the Indian Ocean region. The Chinese Navy is growing at an astounding pace, and Chinese submarines outnumber India's in the Indian Ocean. China now has a proper naval base at Djibouti on the Horn of Africa. China is actively trying to inveigle countries like Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and Bangladesh in the Indian Ocean littoral to be a part of its initiatives. Apart from this, China has plans to take control of Kaikupa port on the Arakan coast in Myanmar. Further to the south, it plans to build a canal, the Kra Canal, which will connect the Andaman Sea with the Gulf of Thailand, bypassing the Malacca Strait. These initiatives, together with China's control over Gwadar port in Pakistan and Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, will give China a virtual stranglehold across the Indian Ocean region, tilting the regional military balance in favor of China. India has therefore every reason to feel concerned. What is the security outlook in our neighborhood? Pakistan and China are two countries in India's neighborhood that pose a threat to our security, though the nature of their threats varies. China seems more intent on jeopardizing India's relations with its neighbors in South Asia and in increasing China's own influence in the region. Through a combination of economic and military diplomacy, China has succeeded in increasing its influence at India's expense in Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Myanmar. Very recently, India has retrieved partially its position in the Maldives. In Bhutan, India is just about managed to hold its own despite China's blandishments. Doklam, to some extent, gives an indication of China's intent and potential in the region. Ladies and gentlemen, the principal threat to India, as also to the security of South Asia, however, comes from Pakistan. Pakistan is intent on disturbing the peace in the region and of India and Afghanistan in particular. Its deeply laid plans include converting Afghanistan into a strategic rear in the event of a major conflict with India. Pakistan is currently engaged in further cementing its relations with China, earning the sobriquet all-weather friendship. Pakistan has facilitated China's involvement in Afghanistan and been instrumental in making it a party in the talks with the Afghan Taliban. India has been kept out of these talks, even though the US, Russia, China, and Pakistan are all involved, thus greatly reducing India's leverage there. The bigger threat from Pakistan to India is, however, from cross-border terrorism. Since the Kargil War, at the turn of the century, Pakistan has switched tactics from open warfare to using terrorism as a strategic instrumentality, employing the Lashkar-e-Taiba, the Jaish-e-Mohammed, the Haqqani network, and the Taliban to weaken India. Growing alignment with China has further encouraged it to employ terror tactics with impunity. The deteriorating situation in Afghanistan, a country in which India has invested heavily, is again of vital concern to India. Afghanistan is the most terror-prone state in the world today, and its very existence as a state is in jeopardy. The recent decision of the United States to withdraw its forces from that country will further complicate the situation. The Afghan Taliban is certain to become the most influential force there, and India, having little contact with it, faces a difficult situation. A Taliban comeback is certain to embolden radical Islamist militancy in the region, including in Kashmir, leading to adverse conditions across the region. Elsewhere in South Asia, the security situation does not look too promising. Sri Lanka is embroiled in political wranglings of a very unfortunate kind. Maldives has come back from the brink, but the situation is yet to stabilize. In Bangladesh, Sheikh Hasina has won a spectacular victory, but radical Islamist forces there still pose a threat to Bangladesh and neighboring countries like India. To India's west, the situation is equally uncertain. New alignments in West Asia reflect growing intimacy between Saudi Arabia and Israel against Iran and its acolytes in the region. This could prove disastrous. Qatar is in direct conflict with most countries in West Asia and is becoming increasingly aligned with Iran. The Syrian government seems to have re-established its position, but the situation is highly volatile. The war in Yemen continues with no clear victors. From a national security perspective, internal security is of seminal importance. Since independence, we have faced several agitations, but have managed to successfully weather them without having to resort to extreme measures. Terrorism, as all of you would agree, is a cardinal danger and the single most serious threat that we confront today. In this century, for instance, we have witnessed several violent incidents organized by radical Islamist terror groups, most of whom were aided, abetted, and encouraged by Pakistan. The most daring attack of this nature witnessed till date, as all of you know, was that by a group of Pakistan-trained and funded Lashkar-e terrorists on November 26, 2008, in which over 170 persons were killed. While one Pakistan terrorist was captured and successfully prosecuted, the other 9 were killed by the security forces. Unfortunately, the masterminds behind the attack still remain in Pakistan, enjoying the patronage of the Pakistan government. No attacks of this magnitude have occurred since. We, however, have had several sporadic incidents which were launched, many of them were launched and supported by Pakistan. In 2018 alone, there have been quite a few terrorist incidents, and only recently security agencies have reported foiling 2 major terror attacks. The terror attack, therefore, ladies and gentlemen, has by no means abated. Elsewhere as well, terrorist incidents continue to be reported. The United Kingdom, Europe, and the United States all have reported terror attacks. The resilience of extremist theology, which helps in attracting new recruits, as well as the intrinsic strength and capacity of terrorist organizations such as the Al-Qaeda and its affiliates, the Islamic State, and an assortment of like-minded terror groups with regional affiliations such as the Boko Haram and the Al-Shabaab confirm that terrorism will continue to remain the major threat that India and the world face now and in the future. India hence cannot afford to drop its vigilance. Intelligence agencies are already warning that Pakistan terror outfits are training their cadres for Samundri Jihad and preparing them for underwater strike capabilities. Apart from terrorism, as of now, the most serious internal threats are those posed by the deteriorating situation in Kashmir and the resurgence of ethnic subnationalism in the northeast. Unfortunately, the situation in Kashmir seems to be worsening by the day and is hence particularly worrisome. Pakistan's sponsorship of violence in J&K is not a new phenomenon. But what we are seeing today is a virtual breakdown of law and order and of governance in the state. 2018 witnessed some of the highest levels of violence in Kashmir since the beginning of the troubles there. The numbers of security force personnel killed have also been the highest ever. Even more daunting has been the hiatus and non-cooperation between locals and the authorities, which has reached alarming proportions. Many of the terror outfits that had been eliminated previously have resurfaced with renewed vigor. There is no end in sight to the violence and troubles there. Governor's rule or president's rule has had little impact on the prevailing situation. The other grave internal security threat is the widespread unrest across the entire northeastern region, consequent on the enactment of the Citizenship Amendment Bill 2019. The bill, which seeks to provide Indian citizenship to non-Muslim migrants from Bangladesh, Pakistan and Afghanistan on the ground that they fled to escape religious persecution, is seen by people in the region as likely to alter the status quo. Many fear that even the character of some of the states could undergo a change. This has helped unite vast segments of people across the entire region. The divisive potential of the recently enacted bill in an election season mandates careful handling, for the resurgence of violence has revived the hopes of several other militant groups in the northeast which had become dormant, such as the NSCN-INM, as also NSCN-K, the ULFA and several other tribal groups. Coming to the left-wing extremist or Naxalite movement in the country, this movement continues to wax and wane. In 2018, there was a marginal increase in violence, though the movement has remained confined to some areas in the states of Chhattisgarh, Andhra Pradesh, Maharashtra, Orissa and Jharkhand. The movement, however, cannot be underestimated, for it remains ideologically vibrant in many urban pockets and retains a capacity to launch violent attacks on specific targets in its strongholds. India is today listed as the third largest victim of terror, largely on account of the violence perpetrated by left-wing extremists. The leading left-wing extremist organization, the CPI Maoist, has in turn been identified as the fourth deadliest terror group in the world after ISIS, the Taliban and the Al-Shabaab. Several other security threats also need a mention, namely maritime security, nuclear security, and cyber security. But I shall limit myself to the last name, given the nature of this audience. Cyber security, as we are all aware, is a dynamic domain of computing information and technology. Almost every day, we hear reports about ransomware threats. I'm sure that many, if not most, of those present here would be aware of malware such as WannaCry and NotPetya. Likewise, all of you present would be aware of the major data breaches that occurred in 2018, including the one involving Marriott Hotel's Starboard division, leading to information concerning up to 500 million Marriott guests being leaked to an unauthorized third party. As a result, the cybersecurity components of IT budgets are going up. The market forecast is that it will go up to over 124 billion in 2019 from 114 billion in 2018. What I have to say here, however, is that while cyber attacks span the entire spectrum of critical infrastructure, banking and finance, shipping and power generation facilities, there is another and more serious danger, namely cyber attacks by countries to advance their strategic and security requirements. Computer peripherals not only provide a gateway for introducing malware into commercial enterprises, but they also open the floodgate to cyber espionage and cyber intelligence gathering. Today, there are cyber arms dealers in many countries who provide sophisticated malware to both companies and governments. This is obviously not documented, but it is nevertheless true. Cyber attacks belong to the next generation of warfare and incidentally of intelligence tradecraft as well. The current hue and cry against Huawei mainly stems from the fact that if Huawei has the first mover advantage with regard to 5G computers, it would give China a near monopoly for the time being regarding military and intelligence matters. Hence, in more ways than one, the cyber threat is perhaps the most dangerous threat that we face in the coming period. While concluding, I would say that if one were to consider the panorama of national security priorities, one cannot ignore the spate of agrarian and Dalit protests that are taking place in the country. These could become national security issues depending on the scale and intensity of these movements. In the recent past, we have seen major agitation by both agrarian and Dalit groups, and it would hence be a mistake to underestimate the potential while assessing the threat they pose to national security. Finally, all that I would like to add regarding the way forward is to say that eternal vigilance is essential if national security is to be preserved and protected. One must understand the major contours of national security in all its dimensions. I think I stress a great deal on cybersecurity, but there are many more of that kind. Any number of steps cannot replace extreme vigilance and deft handling of problems before they become serious issues. We have a difficult period ahead of us, and I'm sure that this debate will lead to something more worthwhile. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Narayan. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now have the views by the distinguished. I will now introduce Lieutenant General V.R. Raghavan is one of India's leading military strategic thinker. He served the Indian Army for 37 years and retired as the Director General of Military Operations in 1994. May I now invite Lieutenant General V.R. Raghavan to share his views, also introduce the other distinguished experts, and also hand over the proceedings of the session.
If I can be heard at the back. Mr. M.K. Narayanan, during his service, and we had served together and shared many exciting moments, was known for his incisive and very precise way of thinking and presenting an analysis. And today I can add to that the quality of a magisterial survey, for which we thank you, which sets the tone and tenor for this evening's discussion and exploration of what is national security. National security, ladies and gentlemen, is, as he has himself explained, expanded beyond what it was 10 or 15 years ago. And today the phrase that is popular is what is called comprehensive security, where the military dimension, while it is important, becomes only one of the 4 or 5 major dimensions or components. And today the primary component is economic, where trade and energy play a major part. Economic security is critical. Then there is political security, and there are many countries where citizens don't have political security. We, for example, can relate to political security as the constitutional fundamental rights that are guaranteed to us. There is environmental security. There are many parts of the world where there are climate refugees, tens of thousands of them. And finally, the military dimension of security. There is, Mr. Narayanan mentioned economic security as a major dimension. some of you might remember, it also was quoted in the media, that when he was the National Security Advisor, quite some time ago now, because times have changed so much, he had raised serious objections, which was quoted in the media, for the Chinese entry of smartphones and other related technologies into India. He had said that this is one instrument through which an intrusion into our system will take place. And one particular company, which he had pointed out, has figured in a big way recently in the arrest of a lady who is a very senior officer in the Huawei Chinese company. She was arrested in Canada, which has fouled up relations between Canada and China and the United States. So the dimensions of security are many, and we will explore them quickly through the experts who are present here. We have Mr. Sridhar Krishnaswamy, who I will invite first to speak, and he was our correspondent many years ago for 4 years in Singapore, the Hindu correspondent. And as part of that, he traveled extensively in Vietnam, Cambodia, and other parts and wrote very perceptively. He then was the Hindu correspondent in the United States for a long time, from 95 to 2005. He's been in this field for 27 years. He's a PhD from Miami. He has had fellowships in Tokyo, a visiting fellow in Oklahoma, etc. He now heads the media faculty in the SRM University in Chennai, and his perspective on both national and global security will be fascinating to hear to you. Mr. Sridhar Krishnaswamy.
Good evening, and thank you for having me here. When you have people like Mr. Narayanan and General Raghavan, I don't think I would have much substantive things to tell you, except that I wrote down a few things that I thought might be shared here, and that is the challenges and opportunities of 2019 and beyond in the realm of national security perspectives. Ladies and gentlemen, take a good look at the international system today. Not many will come to the conclusion that it is a system in which stability is predominantly the order of the day. The United States and the Russian Federation literally tore up the landmark INF treaty that was signed between Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev. Hailed at one time as the harbinger of nuclear weapon stability, the treaty is now in tatters because the United States believed that Russia was cheating. And what are the consequences? The prospect of a new arms race that will be prohibitively expensive to both the countries, as well as bringing in a new era of instability of nuclear weapons globally. Ladies and gentlemen, also look at the global political, economic, and ecological turmoil in the last couple of years, especially since the advent of the Trump administration in Washington in January 2017. One is tempted to say that there is neither stability nor direction of American foreign policy. Our friend from Germany pointed out in his very brief remarks about traditional alliances. Traditional alliances that have been the bedrock of stability are being threatened. Trade wars unleashed, the constant clamor for sanctions and punitive measures, and international treaties like that of climate change have been given the goodbye. The only silver lining at this point of time seems to be a proposed second meeting in Vietnam very shortly between the President of the United States and the Chairman of North Korea, Mr. Kim Jong-un. But denuclearization and stability in the Korean Peninsula is a long way off by any stretch of imagination. Now, politically, there is a sharp rightward shift in Europe and in America when it has come to the issue of immigration. Neither Europe, the United States, nor even some in the Asia Pacific want hapless victims of war and genocide, especially the ones that are still lingering around in Africa and the Middle East. The lack of direction of the United States and generally whimsical policies of President Trump have brought back images of the Cold War, with the United States on the one hand and Russia, China on the other. And this has brought to the fore the festering wounds of Syria and Yemen, with the latest addition of Venezuela, adding to the jitters of an already anxious world, worried about the impact on global oil supplies and prices. Look at India and its neighborhood, where there is no luxury of taking things for granted. We live not only in a hostile environment, but also against the backdrop of our adversaries constantly fishing in troubled waters, be it Afghanistan, Nepal, or Sri Lanka. And then the ever-hanging sword of terrorism is always over our heads. First from Pakistan, and of late from those of our youth who are sympathizing with dreaded outfits like the ISIS. And some of them may have come back either disgruntled or with an agenda. There is also a worry in some external quarters of India pushing closer to the United States by way of a political and strategic partnership. In fact, there should be reasonable worry even within India of such a posturing. There is nothing wrong in getting closer to Washington. But the question to be asked is if we fully understand the political dynamics, and do we have in place a mechanism to manage a relationship that is changing. Differences are bound to happen even in close diplomatic relationships, but it should be effectively managed so as not to dampen an evolving partnership. For example, in the last 4 or 5 days, the media is full of stories about the fate of about 120 or 30 Indian students who are trapped in a visa scam. The issue of whether it is a scam or entrapment is something that must be very quietly worked out, or for that matter, even with regard to H-1Bs. These are not the kind of issues you settle through the media. Buying high-grade weapons from the United States sounds fancy on the outside, but riddled with thorny problems on the inside. Like, for example, the role of Congress, the US Congress, in an arms deal, the issue of conditionalities on replacements, spares, and so on. It's not a very easy thing to just go, give money, take a plane or something and come back. It's very complicated. People like Mr. Narayanan have been negotiating all these things for a very long time. So what is the problem with American foreign policy as far as India is concerned? Basically, it is one of knowing where exactly Trump is coming from. Or is he coming from anywhere at all? Washington wants India to be involved in Afghanistan. But we are not sure the extent of United States commitment in Afghanistan to begin with. Right? First, Trump said, I won't talk to the Taliban. Now he is not only talking, but he is also negotiating with the Taliban. And he does not even know the extent of Indian involvement. He thinks we are building libraries there. At least he should go and visit the library. He would know what is happening. And he wants India to put military soldiers. He wants to see Indian boots on the ground. Likewise, for India, we have to know exactly where Trump is coming as far as Pakistan is concerned. Today, Imran Khan is at the receiving end from Trump. But we never know what is in store tomorrow. For 5 decades, the leadership in Islamabad has been successfully fooling successive American governments, Republican and Democrat. And why should Trump be any different? What I'm trying to tell you, and I'm just going to sum up in the next minute or 30 seconds. India should be very wary about its national security imperatives. It should avoid falling into any trap, be it with respect to Iran, Russia, or Venezuela. India must keep in mind that geopolitical realities must sync with Indian national strategic and economic interests. Thank you very much for giving me a patient hearing.
Thank you. Indeed. I think the observations on Mr. Trump and the unpredictability of US policies were starkly highlighted by him. Our next expert and observer would be Professor Varun Sani, who is currently the Vice Chancellor of Goa University. He was earlier the Vice Chancellor of Jammu University. And of course, he has had a long innings in the Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi. He has a background at Lincoln College in Oxford, in Sandia Lab in Albuquerque in the United States, a Mexican studies background and Australian National University background. He's an expert on many subjects including nuclear deterrence, great powers, and the way great powers play their power play, and of course on international relations. So it will be fascinating to hear what Dr. Sani has to say. Over to you.
Mr. Narayanan, General Raghavan, my hosts at the Madras Management Association, the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, the Observer Research Foundation, my distinguished co-panelists, ladies and gentlemen. A very good evening to all of you. We've been really treated to a festival of ideas with regards to security already. And what I propose to do is in fact two rather different things. I want to first focus a bit, really focus at a certain level of granularity at certain issues that I do believe in terms of India's national security can be characterized either as deficits or as dilemmas. And having done that, I then would like to sort of pull back and sort of get a sense, as I see it, of course, of the big picture. So first of all, I'd like to focus on two issues that I would see as issues relating to capabilities. For me, the most important of them is the Agni 5. It's a 5,800 kilometer range, 3-stage solid fuel engine missile, ballistic missile. It was initially supposed to be ready for deployment in 2011, 2012. And every time over the last decade that I have been on a forum discussing India's national security, I always ask the same question: where are the Agni 5s? That if there is a case that you can make of a single weapon system, of a single platform, fundamentally transforming strategic and geopolitical relations, it's the Agni 5s for us. That weapon system would give us coverage over all of China's national territory. Until such time as we have the Agni 5s in serial production and in squadron service, we are and always be on the back foot when it comes to China. So I think, for me, looking at it at a certain degree of granularity, that's issue number one. It, to my mind, is a really fundamental deficit. Another issue that I think to some extent goes with the Agni 5 issue, I think it's time we really began to, those of us who are concerned about India's national security, a real sort of discussion about it is about the relative non-performance of DRDO, particularly relative to the Atomic Energy Commission and the Space Commission. We really do need to ask the question. I think I have some tentative answers. We're happy to share with you in the Q&A. But it's quite remarkable that you've got these different agencies, all of which are in the high technology realm, all of which are in strategic technologies of one sort or the other. Two of them are really incredible Indian success stories, space in particular. And then you have one which just is a story of delays and shortfalls and lack of achievement of targets and so on and so forth. It again goes to our core capabilities. We can never be a power of the first rank if we are dependent on other suppliers, other states for our weapon systems. A couple of issues that I would characterize as organizational issues. The first of them is jointness. We still do not have a CDS system in our country, a Chief of Defense Staff, a one-point professional military person who can give advice to the head of government, unmediated by any other office of state. That's essential. We don't have it. When we think about jointness in our country, even today, we are largely still thinking about in tri-service ways. And the irony is, a lot of our military officers actually start up joint. We are one of the few countries that actually operates at the level of an officer academy, a joint institution in the National Defense Academy in Khadakwasla. So it's a curious case where you start up joint as a cadet, and then you specialize, and then you stay in your service silos pretty much for the rest of your career. And I think linked to this organizational issue is the question of military education and training, which again, to my mind, is becoming now a core concern. The fact that successive governments have not been able to set up a national defense university, and that all our military educational and training institutions have not been integrated under that university. A university that looks at national security requirements, that looks at specific service requirements, but also looks at the requirements of those individual personnel. I think it's a huge issue, and I think one that we need to focus on. Then a couple of issues that I would sort of put in the category of force structure issues, one of which is in the maritime domain, and I'm going to just again in bullet point form state it. It's really the question ultimately of aircraft carriers versus submarines. Because there is a core doctrinal dimension here, and we need to be clear about whether ultimately we are going to pursue a sea control or a sea denial strategy. And in doctrinal terms, what are we going to do? And the platform will flow out from doctrine. Doctrine determines everything else. Doctrine comes first. Everything else flows out of doctrine. And so at a doctrinal level, that kind of clarity. The Navy's done a great job, by the way, in bringing its doctrine out. So have the other fighting forces. So I don't want to underestimate the significance of that. But I think there is much greater work that needs to be done. I think we need to have people and thinkers from outside the Navy beginning to sort of mull over some of these issues. Flowing out of this is another issue which I think is really important. And I think it's really, in some ways, I would see it less as a deficit, more as a dilemma. And I'll state it as a question. Can a country ever have an authentic expeditionary capability, namely an ability to project power, including military force, at considerable distance from its national territory, if a significant part of its army remains mired in internal security duties? I think it's a fundamental problem. You know, it's not just a kind of which service gets a greater share of the military budget. We've got to look at it in a very different sense. That as long as a significant part of our army is dedicated to internal security duties, we have a fundamental problem in building a force that actually has authentic expeditionary capabilities. A word on cyberspace, on which Mr. Narayanan has already said so much that is relevant. And I'll just again put it very simply. In the early years of the internet, it was seen very much in terms almost of the anarchy of the internet, that somehow now you had a technology that was going to transcend state power and state control. I want to suggest to this very distinguished audience that every time a new technology emerges that creates a new type of space, the sovereign territorial state moves to territorialize that space. And quite simply, the sovereign territorial state will not allow a space to exist that is not under its sovereign territorial control. And there's an analogy going back to the early years of the last century, of the 20th century, when heavier than air machines took flight and human flight actually became possible. All this business about the air columns over one's territory, you know, this notion of the skies as being the abodes of the gods and the angels and the birds. Free as the bird is a term that exists in about 86 different languages. And that all changed. When heavier than air technology became a reality, a new space was opened up that's called airspace, and states moved rapidly to territorialize that space, to the extent that today every single flight across international borders follows very strict air corridors. let us not expect that this new technology, this new space that's been spawned by this new technology that we call information technology, is going to be immune from this logic. This notion that we are going to be able to live in a world without cyber warfare is a very fanciful and ultimately completely mistaken one. And I think all states, including ours, have to get really serious now about cybersecurity. The question is ultimately whether something that is territorialized will be securitized or not. In the case of outer space has still not been securitized because of international treaties. I think cyberspace is already securitized. The question is it going to be militarized? That's the question that we now need to ask. Airspace, as we know, is militarized. So pulling back then from what I've just said about cybersecurity, and just a couple of points, and I'm going to stop. The first of them is this, that we live in an era of strategic uncertainty. It may sound like a banal statement, but I think it's really important that we understand this. It's not even clear, frankly, whether we are actually living through a moment of power transition, namely about the relative movement in the power of states, some states rising relative to others, some states declining relative to others, or we are living through something, or we're going to get to something different, which is system transformation itself. That we're going to actually have a different system qualitatively from the system that has existed so far. I would suggest to you that we don't know. We don't know. And so what happens when we are living in a moment of strategic uncertainty? There's only one rational strategy to follow, and that is a hedging strategy. You don't put all your eggs in one basket. Hedging strategies are the only rational strategies today. That is actually good news for us in India because we are very good at playing hedging strategies. Non-alignment was nothing other than a very elaborate hedging strategy. So we need to sort of therefore not be surprised when we find ourselves active in BRICS with Russia and China, active in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization with Russia and China, and also active in the Quadrilateral Initiative with the US, Australia, and Japan. It may seem superficially to be a huge contradiction. I would urge very strongly for us to consider that it is not. And I think it's extremely wise that we are, whether we are consciously doing it or subconsciously doing it, we are playing a hedging game. I believe we are doing it consciously. We are not articulating it in our official documents, but I believe that we're doing it consciously. And I think in the long run, the historic role for India in the Indo-Pacific region is going to be a catalyst, a prime mover for cooperative security, which is sorely missing in the Indo-Pacific. The Indo-Pacific, which is now the cockpit of world affairs, is a region that is completely bereft of any type of institutional architecture. Unlike the Euro-Atlantic, which was rich and dense in institutional architecture, there's almost none in this part of the world. And it's actually dangerous not just for us, it's dangerous for the entire world. And my sense is that India is going to be playing a critical role there. History, ladies and gentlemen, I would suggest to you, is in fact, sadly, not a very good guide. So, looking at history and seeing what's happened in the past, illuminating and instructive though it often is, I suspect is not going to ultimately help us very much this time. And this is my last point. You can look at it in different ways, and I'll just put it in 2 or 3 different ways extremely briefly. One way to ask is, which were the last great powers to emerge? And if you ask that question, the answer is Japan and the Soviet Union in the 20th century. And how did they emerge? Both of these powers emerged in the crucible of war. As Paul Kennedy tells us, war has played a critical role in the rise and fall of the great powers. War stimulates the potentially strong and drains the essentially weak. So war is that real test. But in this era of military technology, you can no longer have great power wars. Nuclear deterrence, weapons of mass destruction, make great power wars impossible. So how do you then mark this relative rise and fall of great powers? That's a fundamental question. Another way you could ask this question is, what was the last hegemonic power to decline? And the answer is, it was the United Kingdom. But the United Kingdom did something very smart. It actually engineered its own relative decline in favor of the United States. I don't have time to get into it, but for one classic example, withdrawal west of the Suez. The Royal Navy essentially left the Indian Ocean and handed over the Indian Ocean to the US Navy. And as a matter of fact, handed over Diego Garcia as well to the US Navy. That's not going to happen this time around, is it? There's no way in which you can expect the United States to engineer its relative decline vis-a-vis China. It's not going to happen. Britain could do it because Britain was confident that its interests would be protected under an American hegemony. There is no such relationship between the United States and China. And the last two times that we had great powers was France under Louis XIV, 1660 to 1712. And secondly, Britain at the time of Victoria, 1860 to 1910, both a period span of half a century, 50 years. In both cases, the singular hegemon ultimately cedes power to a multilateral system, a multipolar system. So French hegemony is replaced by England, Habsburg Austria, and Russia. British hegemony is replaced by the rise of the United States, of Japan, and Germany. At the moment when you think about the United States, the relative decline of the United States, we are still thinking about it in terms of one single power replacing the United States. So I think in some ways it seems to be multipolarity, and the possibility of multipolarity is a key issue here. And by the way, and this is quite literally my last point, when we think about the relative decline of the US, let's note that the United States today still has 54% of global naval capability. 54%. And I could give you a whole bunch of other data to buttress my argument that in terms of hard power, if you look at it purely in terms of hard power, the United States still is the leading power in the international system. I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
It's good that the military comes last after this fantastic survey of international relations as it evolved, of great powers as they evolved and gave way to rising powers. India is called the rising power. We'll have to see how far it rises and how long it takes. Yesterday I received a copy of the strategic survey by the International Institute of Strategic Studies in London, where I was a council member for many years. And its survey, which is a Western point of view, no doubt, by British Institute, but linked to the United States, a Western point of view. It raises a new term. What sort of warfare are we witnessing today? There are no wars where thousands of tanks are going across borders or hundreds of aircrafts attacking like Second World War. The phrase they are using today is called tolerance warfare. I was fascinated by this phrase, tolerance warfare. What does it mean? It refers to the kind of war which, according to them, Iran is waging in the Middle East, which China is waging in Southeast Asia, which Russia is waging in Ukraine and Crimea. In other words, keep on attacking at thresholds which are lower. Don't cross the threshold of tolerance of a country, but attack it otherwise, cyber-wise, terrorism-wise, economic-wise, trade-wise, embargo-wise. Keep the offensive on, but don't cross the threshold of tolerance. Interesting phrase. We have faced this in India for 30 years. Our tolerance has been stretched up to breaking point by the same methods. What China does in Doklam or in Ladakh is another form of tolerance war. Keep on lighting fires under our feet, but don't let it climb to a full-scale war. That's what Pakistan does. That's what forces the hand of a government on so-called surgical strikes, in my opinion, are completely wrong tactics, but nevertheless it was attempting, and it shows that India's patience, India's threshold of tolerance was crossed. Interesting, isn't it? Tolerance warfare. And that leads me to the point that there have been no full-scale wars. And as Professor Sani says, there are unlikely to be full-scale wars. I came back from a visit 2 days ago to my regiment, where I spoke to a number of commanding officers and senior officers who have done maximum time in Kashmir. And when I asked them, what is the future there? There is no doubt that military is going to be the permanent presence there. It will be the permanent band-aid. It will not cure the ulcer, but the band-aid will keep the situation under control. You don't want the military there. You don't want the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, but you want the army. It's a band-aid to what is a permanent wound. Elsewhere in India also, military is a felt political need. There are many states in India where there is an elected government in place. The courts are functioning, colleges are running, transportation carries on. In the northeastern state, thousands of lorries from mainland India go every day, taking supplies. So normal life carries on. But the elected government feels it necessary to have the army around. So the Armed Forces Special Powers Act and all that goes beyond. So we have a situation of a dilemma. In Kashmir, for example, the dilemma is that political solution is critical because there is no military solution. But a political solution is unattainable. Unattainable. And even more so after the US pull out from Afghanistan. Indeed, the US presence in Afghanistan was in our interest. Now, as for hard military security of actual war, there are a number of dilemmas which India faces. One is, of course, that we have two different fronts, the China front and the Pakistani front, where two different types of armies are required. One requires the full-scale war of tanks and aircraft and navy, etc. Whereas the Chinese front, the Himalayan front, requires a different type of army suited for mountain warfare. But more than that, the dilemma which even countries like England and France and others are facing is, even as the likelihood of a full-scale war has gone down, every country will have to be prepared to fight that war. You can't say full-scale war is unlikely, therefore we don't want full-scale armies. Therefore the cost of the armies, the cost of the defense budget, the need for the latest equipment will never end. And India is a prime example of it, where it requires the latest technology weapons, whether it is the aircraft or submarines or tanks or artillery. And we have therefore become one of the largest importers of armament systems. Largest importer. And we don't manufacture it because we haven't encouraged the private sector. Our scientific laboratories and DRDOs haven't risen to the occasion, etc. So we will continue, as we will continue to import, we will continue to have the scandals and the scams of Rafael and Augusta Westland and submarines, etc. This is going to be a reality. All it requires is for China to offer 100 latest tanks to China, to Pakistan, free of cost, and our entire system goes into an action mode. We need high-end tanks. We need to import more because we can't make them here. Hopefully, the Make in India slogan or the strategy or concept of this government or the current government, it is not new. Previous governments have attempted it. They have continued to work on it. But it shows the ceilings on the Indian capacity and capability. So the future must be seen in the form of these continuing dilemmas which are not going to go away. I therefore feel, for example, when my visit to Delhi and speaking to my regimental officers, as a consequence of Kashmir, we have brought 2 generations of Indian Army officers, very competent, very brave, extraordinarily committed to doing only this sort of warfare. Except that once in 2 years or 1 year we take the army out for an exercise in the deserts of Rajasthan and put them through their paces. But the concept of a full-scale war has gone into background, and we have got today senior officers coming up whose only experience is of the threshold warfare or the tolerance warfare or of anti-terrorism combat action. That is the reality, in short, of the future. And in 2019, or even I would say 2020, 21, I don't see the scenario changing. This is the reality for which we'll have to be ready. Political solutions are not coming. Military solutions are not going to get us the answers. I will end at that because much that needs to be said has been covered by the wonderful experts, for which I thank them. It's now Mr. Narayanan's turn to respond to what we three had to say. But if you don't wish to say anything, that of course will disappoint everybody. But we would really like to know, because quite a lot of interesting ground was covered by Varun Sani and Sridhar Krishna Swami. After he responds, we'll have questions and answers, and it will be now my pleasure to hand over to Mr. Satyamurthy. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.